This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 85.
What I tend to do is not so much say, here, this is what I want you to look at, but I'm a big proponent of access to primary sources. So, giving students access to where that information could be located.
Welcome to a real world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Ken Ehrman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I am here with my co-host, Mr. Matt, the founding father Rogers. Matt, what's going on, my friend?
There's a funny story. So when I was in high school, I was in theater quite a bit, theater and track and field. And when those performance and track meets were the same day, it was not always a great mix. There were some, invitationals. I would wear makeup out to the high jump pit. But all that being said, I was actually Thomas Jefferson in the show 1776.
Wow.
Not that you care to know, but it was probably one of my biggest roles.
So, not that you care to know, but there's someone that works in my district. His name is William Penn, and he is a direct descendant of William Penn. So
That's fascinating.
anytime I interact with him, I call him William Penn. I don't call him anything short. He gets the full name. Founding fathers, we have a conversation today with Theresa Maughan, who is the New Jersey State Teacher of the Year for 2022. And she's a social studies teacher. And we talk a lot about social studies and we talk a lot about history. But I can promise you, as someone who is neither of which, including Matt as well, that I think this conversation is completely applicable and completely beneficial to teachers of any age and any content area. Matt, do you agree?
Totally, 100%.
Can you share why?
Do you really want me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right.
See if you can keep it quick.
I will say this conversation for me felt like the representation of let's talk about good teaching practices and then look at the content afterwards. And Ken, actually, you asked an awesome question in the middle of the interview that talks about a social studies teacher tends to have the content be at the top priority of responsibility. And Theresa kind of goes and says that, yeah, that is, the end goal is to cover that information, but it's not that important unless all of the foundation items that, guess what, are just good teaching practices regardless of what you are learning or trying to teach. And it's just so interesting to hear that from such, as you mentioned, a content dependent subject area. Like, I understand in my role, I have to teach all the different subject areas. So it's good to really invest that time in the relationship early on to be like, all right, we're going to stop now and transition. We're going to find those connections in between to talk with Theresa and hear all of the current events or all the historical factual data or all the primary resources that they're referencing. It is so easy to shift content heavy. And what we heard was, well, if you really want to do it well, you don't forget the teaching skill that's behind it because the content will teach itself. Hopefully that sums it up for you fairly well.
It does. And what I loved about the conversation is I feel like lately and just in general, we get on the topic of being vulnerable, developing relationships with students, being open and honest, sharing a little bit about your personal life. And it usually circles around the topic of building classroom culture and community. And that's why we're talking about that. We talk about that today with Theresa, but she talks about how important it is to do that to directly impact the content of her classroom, and how her personal stories and learning the stories of her kids actually has a direct impact on how effective she can deliver the standards and the objectives of her content. And I really enjoyed that, and I think that is really beneficial for anyone to hear. So without delaying this any further, let's jump into that interview with Theresa Maughan.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcasts. Now let's get back to the episode.
Hi, Theresa. Welcome to the Powered Up Podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
We're doing great. Thanks for giving up some time during your summer break to chat with us. So to kick things off, please officially introduce yourself. Let us know where you are coming from and just give us a snapshot of your career in education.
Sure. My name is Theresa Maughan, and I'm coming to you live from Northwest New Jersey in Morris County in Randolph. And I teach in Essex County in New Jersey in East Orange. I am a high school history teacher, social studies teacher, but I have a career that spans 40 years. Yes, that's with a 4 and a 0. And I actually started my career as a sixth grade teacher in a parochial school for 5 years, and then transitioned to the East Orange School District, where I've been for 34 years. I did teach 1 year in high school in Jersey City also before moving to high school in East Orange. So it's a career that I love, and it doesn't feel like 40 years at all, but it is.
That is a long time, and incredible that you've been in education for that long. So I want to dig into your first part of your career first. So you taught sixth grade for a little while in a Catholic school or parochial school. So what do you feel you gained in those first few years teaching sixth grade that has, without a doubt, carried into the span of your career, and even now teaching high school students, that you felt were just valuable pieces of what you learned during that time that just continues to serve as good teaching practices?
Well, as you know, when you teach sixth grade, at least in the parochial school where I worked, I wasn't so much content specialist. I wasn't focusing only on social studies. I actually taught everything from, religion, art. The only things I did not teach was math. There was a math specialist, if you want, and I was the social studies specialist, and there was a science specialist, my two co teachers. And it was the best place to actually start my career because they were the best mentors I ever had. I always remember the very first day when the students arrived, and I tell this story when I speak to pre service teachers. I walked into the classroom, and there were 26 pairs of eyes looking at me. And I actually had a little panic attack and walked out of the classroom. And the other two, I went to find the other two teachers, and they were like, get back in there. You know, the kids are more afraid of you than you are of them. So it was wonderful. I mean, I really definitely perfected my craft in those 5 years. I learned, things that you didn't learn when you were doing your education courses, when I was doing my education courses, the real practice, because my student teaching was a little bit, different. I had two male teachers who I did it in high school, a high school world history class and a high school US history class. And both of those teachers basically said, here you go. Here are the, it's yours now. And they only showed up when the supervisor from Rutgers, my university, showed up. So there wasn't a lot of mentoring going on in that experience. And then when I transitioned to high school, I realized that, the class I was teaching was ninth grade at that time, and they were just a little taller than the sixth graders. Kids have the same needs. Sixth grade, they're really, really sweet when they walk in. And then, by June, they've kind of gone through some changes and some growth, and puberty sets in. And so the ninth graders were just, as I said, a little bit bigger than that. So I felt really prepared having done those first 5 years with sixth grade.
I think when looking at that age range, I teach fourth grade. Sometimes I feel like I can't handle teaching older, and I definitely don't necessarily feel like I can handle teaching much younger. And it's a comfort level. And I realize, at least through the conversations I have, we as teachers just find a niche of what we are comfortable with. And so, you know, I could never view myself teaching high school because I don't know content at a level depth. Even if I'm not dealing with the same behavior based issues. So I guess the idea of having exposure to younger grade and then transitioning up to that high school, um, are there any things that you feel like, having taught high school so much, you wish you knew about, that further growth, or that, scope and sequence, that if you could go back to that sixth grade classroom, you would bring to early years in your classroom?
I don't know. It's an excellent question. Definitely my niche is high school. I have a daughter who's also a teacher, and she does middle school right now. She has seventh grade and eighth grade, but she has gone down as far as like teaching third grade. And I've always looked at her and like, I really could never ever do that. I think that what it's probably more, as I said to you, in the opposite direction in terms of the experiences with those sixth graders. It always reminds me that my 11th graders, 12th graders, 10th graders, that they have the same needs. Sometimes we look at high schoolers and we expect them to be 100% like little perfect adults, and they're not. They're still trying to figure themselves out. And so I feel blessed having had that middle school experience. I think it really helps me to connect and to try and really look at them as a whole person, and notice that they're an evolving person. They're growing just as sixth graders were growing.
So I have a question about social studies specifically, because I think it's a interesting and important and a subject area, especially in high school, that I feel like can go many directions. So, um, one side of it is, in most schools, I'm sure it's the case in yours, students, for lack of a better term, have to take your class. It's part of the core subjects that they're required to enroll in. I think learning about history, not only in our own country but across the world, learning about current events, why these things are happening in current times, and how it connects to the past. I think all of that is really important for us as human beings. But I also find a lot of times that the content is just so heavy, and the content is at the top of what's important in a high school social studies classroom, and it's very factual based. What do you do in your classroom that goes beyond the facts and goes beyond that, and talking about your connection with students, not only in relationships but connecting with them in terms of how the content is important to them, whether it be the use of projects where you're introducing them to skills that they can learn while they're exploring the content. What are things that you do to make it very relevant for your students that you have each year?
It's excellent. One of the first thing is that I always consider myself a student, right? Um, I begin the year by telling my students that I am a lifelong learner. And keeping that in mind, it has actually guided me through these years as a teacher. I have personally grown, and I like to study my craft. So I read bell hooks, Teaching to Transgress. I don't know if you're familiar with bell hooks, or this little yellow book, and I really think it's something that all teachers should read. And within that book, she had a statement that a classroom should be an exciting place, right? And so that's what I begin with at that point. And I've evolved from just being a content deliverer, because that's kind of what you were describing. And I think that is a misconception. Content is important, but at the high school level, it's not going to mean anything if you don't find a way to make it relevant. So, to make anything relevant, you have to build connections. And my classroom always begins with building that connection. So I spend valuable, worthwhile time in the beginning of the year just trying to help myself understand who I'm sharing this learning space with. So I do a lot with identity, having my students kind of reflect on their own identity. I try to create a more unified, encompassing environment where they feel safe and they feel like it's a place of belonging. And I open up to them about who I am because I expect and ask that they do the same. So we do a lot of exercises about who am I, how do I see myself? How do others see themselves? And then I build from there because now I have a sense of who they are culturally. I have a sense of what their backgrounds are. And now I can connect the content that I'd like to share with them, in a way that seems relevant to what they do. And I love being a social studies, a history teacher. I couldn't do anything else because I find there are so many real world and important connections. And I also am a project based teacher, that a lot of what I ask my children to do, it is based on projects. But those projects are things that give them choice, right? I like them to be able to choose the areas of interest. And I set parameters because, of course, we are a history class. Um, but within that parameter, they have really a great deal of opportunity to pick what areas of interest, grabs their interest at the beginning of the year.
I think one of the greatest joys of being a history and social studies teacher is the art of storytelling, because I feel like it is, the main, and you could correct me, please correct me if I'm wrong, but that is a huge way to engage kids, but also give context behind. I guess my question for you is, as like you are speaking the language that Ken and I live by, where project based with student choice, and all the different features that we would love to see out of classrooms regardless of subject area, where kids are their learning is the product of what they've created. I guess what I'm really interested in is, you mentioned about how you open up about yourself, and I feel like that can be a great tool to, again, get engagement, but there's also that fine line of perspective. You are sharing history or your experiences or your understanding of historical events, compared to, if you read from a, lack of a better term, very by the book textbook version. Where do you feel like you float between, this is my impression of, or what, I found this resource, I want to empower you to have your own opinion? Where do you find your voice comes out stronger, and when do you say, what, let them kind of determine their own perspective?
Yeah, there's a lot to
Yeah.
unpack in there. Number one is the fact that you must have been reading my mind, because history, I describe myself as that history geek. But that's because when I was in school, history was like a story to me, in my mind, it became like a movie, a little bit different than some of the other ways that I filtered and processed the other subjects. So, storytelling is extremely important. It does come into play. And when I'm opening up about myself, what I'm really doing is trying to find ways to build that bridge, to build that connection. My story is one of an immigrant. I have an immigrant story. I was born in Belize. I came to the United States when I was 5 years old. I faced deportation when I was in sixth grade. And with the help of my own teachers, my family was able to navigate through that whole naturalization process. So, teaching in an environment that I do, where my students are 99% students of color, I have African American students. I have students from the Caribbean, from Central America, South America, from the continent of Africa. And many of them have an immigrant story. So it's my story helps them to realize that we have a bond and we build trust. And I think both of you understand as educators that that's an important component of this relationship, this learning process is trust. As far as perspective goes, the one thing that I'd like my students to know is that there are multiple perspectives on history. And what I tend to do is not so much say, here, this is what I want you to look at, but I'm a big proponent of access to primary sources. So, giving students access to where that information could be located, giving them, I believe in a process, and I use it often, it's called structured academic controversy, where you present an issue and then students take a look, find primary sources on that topic, and they respond to a question. It could be a question, and I'll give you a simplified version of it, but I do use it. Um, when we study about exploration and colonization, right? Having them take a look at a topic that they've heard about since elementary school, Christopher Columbus, and then look at it not from the perspective of, say, hero or villain, but is this someone that we should continue to revere, in terms of honoring the holiday? Should the holiday be kept the same? Should it be changed in names? And students go out and they look at Columbus's own journal. They look at, things that occurred in his life, the fact that he was actually put on trial, and so they come up after looking at those primary sources, they're able to fashion their perspective on a topic. So I try to facilitate more than I do impose my perspective on history. And I'm constantly taking classes. I'm still in grad school, working on a second master's in history. So I take these classes as a way to broaden my content knowledge and also, though, to broaden my access to resources and materials that then I bring back into my classroom. So it's really having the student take ownership of that exploration. Like in middle school, I would say to my sixth graders, we're like history detectives. We've got to go out there and solve this mystery. What happened? And are we getting the full picture about what happened?
I think that is, the most ideal situation for learning. And Ken, feel free to jump in where, it is almost understanding the reputation or the almost if someone's renowned. I think about like the Columbus example, you can almost use that as, why do you think people had this perspective and what should the perspective truly be, using, concrete evidence. I think that's fascinating and really empowering in your role. I guess my one thing that you mentioned is just kind of your sharing of your own background in that storytelling, as well as teaching the students. And some of the things, hopefully, for the audience, they have not listened to me ask this question over and over again. um, but I feel like, in the last few years of education, at least as a relatively newer but with experienced teacher, that I can be myself and comfortable with what sharing my life journey, or my belief systems, why I care so much about these kids, why I want them to be successful. And that is different from when I started teaching, when it was, I'm ironing my shirt and making sure that I look like more of an adult than I really am in that situation to be taken seriously. I guess what I would love to know is, you have what sounds like a beautiful, motivating story of why you were hooked on history and the connections you can make with your kids. Do you feel like your vulnerability as a teacher has changed, or it's always been that core value that you've always kind of thread through your teaching and felt comfortable because you saw from an early age, well, maybe not early age, but early time in your career, that it is a value in connecting and making those relationships?
Yeah, no, it's definitely something that I have worked on, and I have grown and become more comfortable in it. I What's important to me is to recruit people into our profession. So, one of the greatest things I love doing is actually speaking with people who are interested in becoming teachers, whether it's at the college level, the high school level, trying to recruit them as soon as we can. And I think it's important to be honest. And I share the fact that, when I began teaching, literally I was like a page ahead of the kids, right? In whatever it is I was teaching. And over time, that content knowledge will come and it will grow. But also the ability to work with creating, that safe learning environment, that comes with experience. Every year I feel like I am literally self-described as a work in progress. And I don't mean it to sound like a cute little bumper sticker. It's who I am. Like every year, I'm changing a little bit, tweaking something that I did the year before that I thought, oh, it may not have worked as well as I wanted it to. Um, Trying to find ways to connect with what my students are interested in. I may be the oldest teenager in history because I really try to understand what it is they're listening to with music, because I love to bring music into my lessons. What are they watching? And they give me tips. Trust me, my viewing list is really based on what my students have said. Oh, Miss Mon, you should watch this. I think you'll really like this. Or, did you see this movie? What did you think of that movie? So that all comes with time. In the beginning, I wasn't as comfortable and honestly did not share my immigrant story when I first began to teach. I had to get comfortable with my own identity over time. And so as I became more comfortable with who I am, it allows me to make space to bring others in and to hopefully help them become comfortable with who they are.
How do you frame advice to younger teachers and perhaps very experienced teachers who haven't reached that point of being comfortable in that sense to open themselves up more? Because Matt and I both agree with you in the value and the importance of that. We believe it ourselves. We've done it ourselves, as well as we hear it almost every week with our guests in different capacities about the importance of that, but also recognizing that it is tough for people. It's something, like you said, you have to be comfortable first personally with yourself and then sharing with students. But what are what are ways that you can advise people in taking small steps towards that?
The first thing I always say to new teachers is don't be afraid to ask, right? Don't be afraid to ask for help. Sometimes we're not comfortable asking others, for advice. We think that we will be judged. So it's important to try. I will seek out those new teachers. There's may not be a process, a more structured process in place within my building, but I do remember, I try to connect to that memory of what it was like for me when I first showed up. So I do try to make myself accessible for anyone that's coming into the profession that's new, and just making sure that I suspend judgment and let them know that I'm suspending that judgment, that I'm not judging you because you want to share that something went wrong. And as far as sharing, now we all know that there are filters as to what we share, right? My students, I love and I adore them, but we're not going to hang out as pals together always, So we still have to remember in the relationship that we are, the adult in that relationship, and we have to make a judgment as to which parts of ourselves, our lives, we want to hold back on. But and you can do that. Maybe it's coming from having, from being slightly older in the profession. But I do recommend that there are some things that you don't necessarily have to friend your students on social media. I really keep, as well, becoming the state teacher for New Jersey, I've had a larger social media presence than I normally would. But even with that, I try to keep my personal life, still much of it is held back. And I think that's important for us to know, because I think our students really want consistency from us. They want to know that we're there for them. And we can do those things without having to reveal every inch of who we are. And so that is sometimes what I will also, share with new teachers. But I don't go by that old, don't smile until December kind of thing. No, that's not it. You can still be that caring, compassionate educator, and still be able to kind of keep some of your personal life personal.
Yeah, I think what what I like to advise is, and I love your advice, is share the things that you think they might care about, they might find funny, they might find entertaining, or that just make you seem human. That is not particularly personal to you. So just a story about one of your children, or a story about going to a sporting event, things that may connect with different groups of students that really are not anywhere close to being very personal to you, as well as listening to them or asking about their lives, and then trying to find ways to connect to that. So if you have a large majority of your classroom that perhaps are in the musical, go to the musical and tell them on Monday, hey, I thought it was great. Or going to one of the sports games if they're on a team for the school, just finding ways, or watching a show that they watch, if it's if they should be
Yeah.
watching it
Yeah,
at that age, depending
it's
on
true.
what grade you teach, so that you can talk about that. I mean, I can remember, probably, I think it was my last year teaching fifth grade. So we're talking 4 or 5 years ago. My students were watching Stranger Things when it first came out, and they were begging me to watch it. And I didn't even have Netflix at the time, but it was a conversation for months in my classroom. And my wife and I actually just started watching it about 6 months ago. And now that I'm a secondary coach, I see a lot of the students that I had. And I mentioned it to one of my students, and she lit up. She was so excited that I finally was watching the show that she begged me to watch for 6 months 4 years ago when I had her as a student, because it was just something that she enjoyed, or it was just a part of her life, something that she does with her friends. So just finding little things that are
Yes.
nowhere near the boundary that you think is appropriate, that start, and you'll start to feel more comfortable and confident in doing that.
And
You
the
mentioned earl Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and the other thing you mentioned that's really important and advice for new teachers is get to know your kids outside of the classroom. As you stated, go to those events, go to the sporting events. If there is a club advisorship available, take a chance, apply for it. Those are the things I really enjoy doing. This year we had, a battle of the classes with basketball, and so what I did was to sponsor the 10th grade basketball team. So we got together and made t-shirts, and they were like Maughan's Eagles. Of course, the deck was stacked against us because the first game they played like a team that had all the all-star athletes on it. We didn't come in first place or second or third, but we had fun, and they liked seeing me there. I love sports. So, just find that connection away from the classroom is very important to do.
Mhm. You mentioned earlier about the use of primary resources, which I think is super important because it's giving them actually the facts, and then they can, interpret it themselves. But the thought that popped into my head is, you're going to have students on varying academic levels in your classroom, and primary resources can be very difficult to read, to understand, to interpret, depending how old it is. The language can be a lot different. And it kind of, in my head, was, while I was listening, connected it to when I would teach reading, and I would have students on very different reading levels. And a lot of the times, the simple scaffold strategy is to provide level text. So, same topic, same set of information, but varying levels of reading so that the students can feel successful and learn the content or understand the story. With primary resources, you can't do that because it's no longer primary if you are. So, what are some strategies that you're using to scaffold for your students so that they can explore it independently? Because that's clearly a big part of your instructional style, but also allowing your varying academic level students to succeed.
Absolutely. There are strategies that you can use with primary sources. One of them is chunking the document, looking at that primary source document and pulling out the parts of it, in smaller pieces for your students. And then perhaps providing them with some guide questions for that small piece, piece by piece. There are resources out there. Stanford University has SHEG, which is Stanford History Education Group. They do a phenomenal job of having lessons that include primary source documents that have been modified for different ability levels. So it's not avoiding the primary sources, it's learning how to use them in a way that you can present them in a way that addresses differentiation for your students. So you're absolutely true about that. History teachers, I used to teach, by the way, when I did do sixth grade, I was an ELA teacher. That one did fall into my realm. And history teachers, we are very much like the ELA teachers in that we use strategies to help our students understand the material that they're being presented with. I don't use a textbook. I have not had a textbook, an official textbook in my course for years, and I like it better that way. Um, but you can still address it for those different levels. Projects, I am really a big proponent of National History Day. I use that within my coursework with my classes. I have my kids compete in National History Day, and it's not the honors kids. It is basically brought before all levels of the students that I teach. And so it does fall on us as the teacher to find those ways to modify the primary sources. And you're not modifying it in a way that's changing the content, you're just breaking it up. Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History offers a lot of guidelines as well for how to use primary sources. Um, the Library of Congress has a tremendous amount of resources that you could use. And all of these different organizations are formatting and presenting the information in ways that teachers can pick and choose what works best for the learning level of your students.
One of the questions that I would love to get your opinion on is activism. I feel like in your role, you have a huge responsibility as a social studies and history teacher to you know demonstrate how to respond to the environment that kids are growing up in. And I mean, that has not gotten easier, I don't believe, in your career as of late. I feel like high schoolers in general. I remember myself as a high schooler feeling like I knew so much about the world when I truly didn't, and I would speak my mind, and I would advocate for the things that I believed in, feeling like I've lived this long life of a lot of depth, and I've had all these experiences. And I find that to be really a beautiful thing about teenage and high school years, also a little bit challenging. So, can you kind of speak to maybe your responsibility of how do you handle current events? How do you handle activism? How do you handle kids inside a same classroom that have distinctively different opinions in a responsible way so that they can continue to be responsible adults when they leave your classroom?
I'll begin with that one because, as you're right, and I do want different perspectives to be shared. At the beginning of the year, as I said to you, we do contracting. And what we do is we collaboratively create our class contract. And, when my students walk in, they'll see that exposed in the room or displayed in the room is the word respect. And that's like the guiding force behind how we operate. So, part of that contract that they ultimately pull together is they recognize the importance to uplift and not put down, right? So that's kind of how I guide them, to be willing to hear what others have to say without interjecting in a manner that makes someone hesitant from sharing. So having that class contract is the best starting point. As far as activism goes, you know, my class this year, our motto for our class was based on John Lewis and John Lewis's advice about getting into good trouble. But especially his part about being willing to say something, do something when you see that something isn't fair or when something isn't just. And some of the activities based on the content that we're studying, some of the projects that my students do actually expose them to entering into the community. It asks them to reach out into their community. When we were studying elections prior to the election of 2020, for example, we studied about voting rights, and we looked at all the different aspects that are involved with how people struggled to earn those that ability to vote. And my students actually created videos that were entitled "Lift Every Voice and Vote." So they created videos to encourage those within our East Orange community. Within our school, we have seniors who could register. I had them involved in, again, it was through Rutgers University had a ballot bowl challenge, where you went out there to try and encourage high schoolers to be sure to register and vote. So these are ways. The topics that they are often exposed to or listed within our content, within our curriculum, allows them to really dig deeper and connect the past. It gives them context to understand the present. So when you ask about current events, my job, this is a challenge. I say to the students, if you bring in a topic for me, a current event topic, I will help you to see how that topic is connected to something from the past. And that's where the context comes in. Now, depending on the environment, depending on the school district, depending on the community, you do end up having pushback at times within a history class. It is a very challenging time to be a history teacher. There is so much that people are resistant to the concept of teaching the truth, teaching multiple perspectives. And it's they like to throw out, right, CRT. And I always say the only CRT that's important to me is culturally relevant teaching. That's my CRT. And so, it again, I'm blessed being in a community where I have that support from the other teachers, from my administration, to be able to hold these discussions. But it is important that students accept the fact that not everyone will see things the same way. And that's what makes this, a wonderful country, that we have that opposing differences of opinion. But we need to make sure that we model for them as adults. And that's where we're falling short, that differences of opinion doesn't mean that you have to be beaten down to come to my point of view. And that's something we need to work
I
on.
think it's so important for for students to be exposed to that type of environment because, like you said, it's not being modeled very well in the public eye right now. We had a teacher on, I think maybe like our ninth or 10th show, that did a lot with activism, and and it was just evident that she was teaching them. They were out of Flint, Michigan, teaching them appropriate ways to challenge authority and to, educate the public, not yelling and screaming, not arguing, but presenting sound ideas in sound ways. And I think it's so important for that to be modeled in schools because it's not being modeled, many other places, or it's not being highlighted, with by our media today. Do you ever get into, so when I taught social studies as a part of the day in fifth grade, I liked to always try to humanize the people they were reading about in the textbook or in the articles we were reading, to help the students understand that these were just people. They were the same people as you and me. They were just living in different times. So I did a simulation activity where I told the kids that I kind of framed it like they had to figure out what they were going to do next in our curriculum, and I kind of just like let them pretty much argue with each other for an entire class. And I kind of teamed them up, and I framed it in a way that I was then able to connect it to the Continental Congress. And I wanted them to understand that, they met for days upon days, and it wasn't just this beautiful process that this magical thing came from it. They were probably yelling and screaming at each other a lot because they had very opposing viewpoints. So again, I wanted them to kind of understand that human element. Do you ever get into, when you're connecting current events to events in the past, not necessarily judging the decisions made by people in the past, but almost evaluating the decision and putting into context the way the world was at that time? So where, you know, things that have happened in our past were terrible. We can all accept that, but also understanding that the time they were living in the time we're living in now has a huge impact on the way we make decisions that will probably be viewed differently in 50 years. Do you kind of understand what I'm getting
I
at?
do. I understand what you're saying. And those are the core skills that we as social studies teachers, that we kind of present and help our students develop. And I'm talking about sourcing, number one, right? Having them understand that you have to look for bias in the materials that you come across. And everyone has their own biases that come into play. So when we look at those sources, we look at those primary sources, just using a strategy to help them source it. Who's the author? What's the time frame? Who's the intended audience for this particular document? What was the purpose? What is the significance of this document in terms of then and any relevancy in terms of today? The other skill is corroboration. Did you find this information in more than one source? When you talk about media today, it's all part of like media literacy, isn't it? That we have to help our students understand. So, this sourcing and this corroboration is not just for primary sources, it's for what the kids see come across their phones as they're looking at it. And then we talked about contextualization, the heart of helping kids to understand what was going on at that time that an event was taking place. So, not just what was happening here, but also expanding it. It's like a donut, I tell the kids. And in the middle of that donut is the event that you're researching about, and everything else around that center, that's what's happening at that time. What was happening in the United States? What was happening in the world? What was happening in this community? So they're able to understand, just as you said, Ken, that there are factors that come into play. And also, they should understand that depending on what the situation is currently, we do have reversals that occur. Whether you're looking at court cases and you're looking at reversals, you had Plessy versus Ferguson, and then you have, Brown versus the Board of Ed. And you could see, well, what happened between that time period that made these decisions change? So I get excited. I really do. I get excited about these 21st century skills that we're trying to instill within our kids. And we still make room for them to be creative and find creative ways to display this. So I love that you did the simulation with your kids on found the writers of the Constitution, the framers. I've done something very similar with it with my students as well. I love to give my kids an opportunity for choosing through choice boards if they want to do a performance as one of those historical figures that they have researched about. Some kids like to write, so they could write an article that covers the debate or covers the issues that were going on. And some kids are artistic and they need to visualize and share that content in a way that others can see. And so giving them that opportunity to create whatever it is that makes them, feel good about their ability and their talents, whether it be a website or a poster or a painting. I've done studies with the kids about the Middle Passage, and it's unbelievable the way they can illustrate what their interpretation of what that experience, always being conscious of trying not to instill trauma, right, on our students whenever we bring up topics that could possibly in some way impact, because that's why it's important to get to know our kids at the beginning of the year, so we have kind of a sense of who they are and where they're coming from with their experiences.
That's great because those aren't easy waters to navigate. And I think it's so easy for social studies teachers in general, but particularly your content area, to kind of avoid those things. But it's so valuable what the students are getting out of it, not to mention the way you're giving them choice in how they display their learning. So I don't want to cut this conversation off, but I do want to be mindful of our time. So I'm going to take us into our exit ticket, which is the same 4 questions we ask every guest every week. We're gonna skip the lesson lens. I know we were ready to talk about it, but I feel like we got a good picture of a lot that you do in your classroom already through our different conversations. So, question number one: what is the best thing a teacher can do to make a student's school experience better?
See them, make them feel visible, make them see themselves within whatever it is you're presenting, whatever materials you're using. I think students need to have this sense of belonging and to know that there's someone there that actually sees them for who they are.
So you've had many interactions with a ton of different people, but what if you were to boil down the best piece of advice you've received, whether it was from a colleague, a supervisor, or even a student?
I would say that it's come from many different directions. And I think that best piece of advice for me would be to, it's all tied together, that you can't separate this concept of being culturally responsive. So it took, a few years for me to recognize the value of investing time in the beginning of the year to really know who you have within your learning environment. Some people would say, oh, you're going to fall behind in the pacing. I say, so what? It will, it's more important right now to invest valuable time in the beginning of the year to do these things, to look at our identities, to create our class contract, to give the kids an opportunity to get to know who each other is. How many times have you, as a student, been in a room and you don't know who the other people really are that are sitting in that room with you because no one's really given you an opportunity to learn about each other. And that, to me, that's the best advice. Just put the curriculum aside for a minute, put that pacing guide aside in the beginning of the year, and spend that week or two to truly get to create a communal, learning environment.
I think it's a beautiful thing to hear from, obviously you represent a state as a teacher of the year to say, we all value standards, but we understand that, I mean,
Yes.
that classic line, all good learning happens through good relationships. So
Yes. And I want to say
go
just one
ahead.
last thing
Yeah.
about standards. It was told to me, I've had a sabbatical where I've spent some time at our Department of Ed here in New Jersey. And one of the first meetings I had referenced standards. And it was stated that a standards are a what, but not a how. And I think teachers need to recognize that how we use and how we address those standards, we want to be able to shape it to best suit who we have within our
Oh, I
classes.
love that. All right, so I'm gonna hit you with the next one, and I'm sure you can connect to it. So the school year clearly goes in waves. Beginning of the school year, we're all excited. Night before we might have some butterflies. The weather gets a little poor, and our mood starts to dip, and we hit these hard times, these stuck in the mud moments, if you will. Report cards, parent teacher conferences. What's something you feel like educators that are listening to this need to hear to power through those moments of struggle?
Yeah, that's true. That's the part of teaching that we all have to contend with. I think I would say that the best way that I get through those moments is just always sticking to and remembering why we do what we do, right? We do have to do those lesson plans. And like everyone else, I'm not a big fan. In fact, I'm like, after 40 years, do I really need to do lesson plans? We all have to do the grading. but we can be creative in how we grade. I don't like a lot of pencil, pen and paper kind of assessments. But when we have to do those mundane things that we all have to do, and we hit March, which is that month with virtually no day off there, we just have to keep centered on why we're here and why we're doing it. And I say, teaching is a career I love, and it has loved me back most often. And so I just kind of hang on to that.
Absolutely. I love it. The last question. It's easy to fall into facilitating a repetitive classroom. What do you think separates teachers who are constantly seeking change, innovation, and implementing new teaching strategies?
Oh, I know 100% what it is. It's professional development. You've got to seek it out. And I wish that more of it was made more easily available. I credit my longevity to professional development. And, we're all at different phases in our lives. We have families, we have young children. Some of us, unfortunately, because of the way our salary guides are, we have to work that second or third job. But when possible, seek out professional development. I cannot tell you how my summers are spent doing seminars, whether through Gilder Lehrman or through the NEH. During the school year, my school district, we have professional development in service days. I give some of that professional development, creating workshops and so on. But I think we need to be able to connect with other educators, learn from other educators. And that's how we can kind of, revitalize what's happening in our classrooms. I say professional development, those workshops, those seminars, those courses, those are my B12 shots. They keep me going in this profession 100%.
So the last thing is really, how do we follow along in your journey, and how do we continue to connect? I know you've shared some incredible things through our episode, which we are super fortunate to have. How you mentioned earlier you're using social media a little bit more than maybe you normally would. What are those best handles and ways we can follow along?
In terms
Just
of keeping
Yep,
in
keep
touch
in
with
touch
me,
and
or
following
just,
along in the
oh yeah.
journey.
Oh, 100%. For me, if you want to follow my journey, I do have a Twitter account. Um, and I wish I'd brought my card to let you know what my
That's
Twitter
okay.
handle is. And I'm on Instagram as my handle is for Instagram is NJ 2022, because I am, the 2022 State Teacher of the Year. I also have a Facebook page, which also uses that same handle. And I am always looking for people that I can follow as well. So we all know that that's the beauty. That's the one positive thing that I not one positive thing, but a big part of what's different teaching now than teaching 40 years ago when I started is what's at our fingertips, how we can connect. I do a book club, with other social studies teachers on Twitter, SS Chat Reads. So there are ways for all of us to connect and just kind of learn from each other. And people are so giving and generous in sharing resources and ideas. I don't pay for resources. I'm not looking down on those that do, but there's so much available that we just like mentoring each other, because that's who we are. We educate each other, not just students.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. We will link up to everything that you said, as well as some of the resources that you share throughout the show, on our show notes page, which can be found at powereduup.com/show 85. Theresa, thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think Matt and I threw some really challenging questions at you in our conversation, and you answered them beautifully with humility and just great insight, as well as some great teaching strategies and ideas that we can bring into our classroom. Your school is clearly very, very lucky to have you. Your students are very lucky to have you for such a long time. So thank you so much for your dedication to education. 40 years is really incredible, and now your state is getting a lot of value from you in a bigger capacity as the teacher of the year. So thank you again for joining us. I know that I benefited from this greatly. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast, whether it be on YouTube or your podcast platform of choice. I always say not to benefit Matt and I, but to benefit teaching as a whole, because Matt and I get to engage in the most incredible conversations week in and week out with amazing teachers like Theresa. And we just want more teachers to hear this, more teachers to benefit from the conversation so they can grow professionally, they can feel inspired, they can feel reinvigorated to give their best to students on a daily basis. So Theresa, thank you again. And
And
Matt, why
thank
don't you
you.
take us on
All
out of
right,
here?
Thank you for having
absolutely.
me.
I will just say, as husband to a wife who's a teacher who grew up in Teaneck and Bergenfield area, not crazy far from you, you definitely make the state of New Jersey proud. So, as we power down this episode, you've left us feeling quite powered up. We are looking forward to following along in the journey as you continue to represent the state of New Jersey. But until next episode, we will talk to you next week.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to or watching us on YouTube. Each week, we get to talk to amazing educators who are making a positive impact on the lives of students, their colleagues, administrators, and education as a whole. It's been such a privilege every week to be able to talk to these incredible individuals, learn from them, grow with them, and better myself and all of education through these conversations. If you haven't already, please consider sharing this with a colleague, someone who can benefit and be powered up from the experience of listening to these incredible conversations. Because of Powered Up, we are powering education by empowering you.